What I think people need to do is ask questions to get understanding of, who the person they're talking to is. Find out, what the what are the pain points, but what are the perceived constraints? What are the obstacles? Well, again, I'll stay in the AI theme because I think it's topical and relevant right now. Within AI, right, every company has a board level directive: go do AI things. Now, that's going to break down across different people in the organization in different ways. If you're at the top of the organization, you're what I would call a perpetrator. You're the one that's like initiating action. If you're a perpetrator, then what you want to hear about is like all the possibilities. Tell me why my idea is so good. And so I need to be like a real zealot. But as you feed that further in the organization, then people they shift from perpetrators to victims. They're the ones that have to carry out the decision of somebody else. Hi, it's Mike Bushong from Nokia, and you are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, and I'm thrilled to have a very special guest joining me today. I'm welcoming Mike Bushong, who is the VP of Data Centers at Nokia in San Diego. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you here as well. I think a really great place to start would be, could you give me a little bit of background on how you ended up in your current role, heading up all things data center related at Nokia?
I'll spare you the LinkedIn, but I guess the short story of that, the too long didn't read. I started off as a tech writer. And so I mention this because I'm telling you, you can get to this place any number of ways. I worked in chip design software, moved up through product management, and then kind of moved into the data center space when I was over at Juniper Networks. It turns out I like strategy, I like psychology, I like product and learning. And then, I'm pretty good at helping, take really complex ideas and translate those into things that everyone can understand. And so, a couple of, different decisions, little turns, a few twists, and here I am at Nokia, working on our data center business here.
What's super fascinating about that combination of the product, the strategy, starting out in tech writing, is I could see how that would play extremely well in relatively small companies and startups and scale-ups where you need to wear a lot of different hats. But I'm super curious in an enterprise environment, how is that? You've worked for huge companies over the years. Is that you found it challenging spanning so many different roles, so many different departments?
What it gives me is credibility, right? So I've done a lot of different things. I've done tech writing, I've done technical training, I've done marketing, I've done operations, I've led communications, I've led large transformation initiatives, I've led, just all the budget and strategy planning and business planning and product management. When you have done a lot of those things, it gives you two things, right? One, I typically have an intimate understanding of how to get things done in a large organization. And two, when I talk to customers, I understand not just what's the product doing and what are they trying to do from a product and solution perspective, but what they have to go through internally to get like budget freed up. And I would say that like that ability to connect down to like, how do you actually get things done? That's probably a superpower for me, and it served me pretty well. I don't know that most people have quite the eclectic background that I have in terms of roles. But what it does mean is I can empathize with a lot of folks, and that makes it easy to build the relationships that you need to be effective.
Yeah, for sure. And being able to understand the process that people are going through to get the budget to make the investments around these huge networking infrastructure is a massive superpower for being able to communicate that to your peers in marketing and sales enablement kind of roles. It's always like when we ask people's biggest struggles and challenges in the space after generating leads and getting decision makers, getting things over the finish line and dealing with complex organizations, big decision committees seems to be an even bigger frustration today in a self-guided journey.
So I actually have one-on-ones with like folks on the customer side where I only talk to them about psychology, leadership, like navigating the morass that is, large companies. Not only is it a big deal, right? It's hard to solve that problem. I'm telling you that sometimes the biggest unmet need, it isn't some port speed or some software feature. It's like, how do I get help, generating enough support for an idea? And those relationships have served me super well. Like it turns out that, I may not do business for a while with that person, but I maintain the relationship. And then, 3 years later, something pops up and they're like, hey, Mike, don't care where you're working, come in and let me know what you're up to. You'd be surprised at what a good book recommendation can do in terms of driving leads down the road.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, the last couple of years, all the big research houses were talking about how the future of being an account executive looks a lot more like being an enterprise project manager for getting alignment across teams and across multiple teams across the company and driving transformation, as opposed to just focusing on a one-dimensional sales plane. So all that comes full circle.
Yeah.
Mike, when you think about where you are in your career, I imagine from time to time you come across some young folks that are either in high school or college that are curious about what these careers might look like, especially in client-facing roles. Maybe especially the last year or two, they've heard a lot about data centers and digital infrastructure and AI, and maybe it's a teenager lives in your neighborhood, a son or daughter of a friend or family member or coworker, and they're real curious about if you could have coffee or have lunch with someone in that role and give them kind of insights on what some of the less technical client-facing career opportunities might look like in this industry.
So I think what people are looking for is clarity. There's lots of information out there. They need to figure out, how do I plot a course? Whenever, like the AI thing, obviously you can't get through a discussion here without saying the letters A and I. What I would tell you is that what AI has done is it's certainly boosted marketing budgets, which has really meant that we're flooding the zone with a bunch of information. At the end of the day, when you talk to people, they're looking for a couple of things, right? What should I do, and how do I have the confidence I can go and do it with you? And so, we need to evolve from being mere purveyors of product. We have to be cultivators of confidence. And that means, relying as much on psychology and on inspiration and on connecting with people. I mean, there's this belief that, sales sort of goes away and that it's people matching, I have a need, where's my product? I don't think that's true. I think people still do business with people. And at the end of the day, you're not just, fitting a data sheet and trying to say, I meet your requirements. It's like, look, I got to believe, if I'm going to buy from you, I have to believe that you're going to be there when I need it and that I can actually get across the finish line. Like I think if people nurture that, and that's really around, how do I develop a relationship? Simple things. How do I learn to listen? I mean, we give some really terrible advice on how you engage with people. I'm going to give you one, this may be a provocative example. We teach people active listening, right? What is active listening? I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to have you talk, and then I'm going to summarize what you say in my own words. That doesn't demonstrate clarity. What that does is it takes your idea and it reframes it around my words. I'd rather see people mirror. I'd rather see people, reflect back what you're hearing and use their language so they see themselves in you. And then, demonstrate that you're on their side, that it's their ideas that you're going to kind of push through. These basic skills about how do you connect with people and how do you use psychology to help forge a bond. I think these are things that are, hard skills. They're not soft skills. They need to be trained and learned. And so I think anyone who's kind of coming up in this industry, look, I think it's important to learn the products and learn the technologies, but I would say, put equal measure behind learning the psychology and how to cultivate relationships, because it's not just common sense. And there are things you can do that will give you a tactical advantage, and you'll forge lasting relationships, because you got to be honest, you're not going to be in a job for 2 years. You're in a career, and you're going to lean on these relationships over and over again. So that long-term thinking is probably the biggest shift for me as an individual, was kind of changing from, transactional and kind of in the moment to something that's really, more long-lived. And so you put all that together, I think it's a discipline that needs to be learned. I think there's a lot of nuance, and I think that the people who recognize that and put in the effort are going to do better, and then understand that communication, relationships, these are not just, soft things that happen between people naturally. I think you got to put a little bit of effort into it, and you can be better at it with a little bit of practice.
So the question is, what role can formal education and higher education place in all of this? Coming from the perspective of someone that's done hundreds of webinars to educate and build trust with people over the last 15 years, what you were just talking through, getting people to believe, reminds me of reading Robert Cialdini's Influence all the way back when I was in college 30 years ago. And at the time, it was using these kind of techniques to influence public policy, using it to ironically talk about sustainability issues. I think if I remember correctly, one of the examples in the book was getting people to not throw their hotel towels on the floor to save energy costs. But it's amazing how much all of these things that existed just a little bit before pre-web are now all of a sudden even more important.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're doing this over, a virtual meeting, right? How do you forge trust when all you can do is look into a camera and see somebody? How do you develop a relationship when you only see them a few minutes at a time? I think the tools and the skills of yesteryear are just as relevant as they are today. And in fact, in some ways, I think we forget about them because we become so transactional, right? I think a lot of the skills in terms of how you influence people, the types of things that you say, how you listen, body language, I think all of these things actually play a role. I think you have to figure out how you apply them in virtual settings. I don't think it's always so straightforward. But I think a lot of the classic education. I mean, look at the books that people are reading now. Half the time a new book comes out, you read it and you're like, oh my gosh, I read this book 20 years ago, right? It was called something different, but this person's clearly ripping off the ideas. I think there's some constants in human behavior, right? I do think that the subject matter has changed. I do think the way we talk about things has changed. I do think that we are moving beyond assertions and sort of the steak dinner type sales model and moving into, having to provide evidence. I do think some of the sales techniques have evolved a little bit, but the relationship pieces that underpin those sales techniques, I think those are actually fairly common. And I think what's happening now is that the people who recognize the psychology that sits behind it, I think they give themselves an advantage. And when you do that and you're deliberate, anyone who does leadership coaching, they'll talk a lot about being deliberate. It just means like applying a particular technique in the moment because you believe it's the technique that's best used right now. I think the people who can do that, those people are going to be more self-aware, more situationally aware, and as a result, they're going to make better decisions for the people they're selling to and working alongside.
So it sounds like, at least in the short term, until there's a lot more places where you can learn about data center technology and learn modern sales, the best thing is sounds like a lot of internships in between your summers and times off to get some significant real world experience before you hit the job market as an entry level grad in your early mid 20s.
I also think getting mentors. I mean, look, I've mentored dozens and dozens of people, like not even necessarily people that are trying to get into roles that are immediately relevant for me, but people who just need help. I think, finding relationships, building relationships with people who've been there and who can, provide a little bit of guidance. What people need is stick time, right? You need repetition. You need a little bit of practice. And I think anything you can do to get that, I really think it helps. I think early career people, a lot of times they don't get the repetitions they ought to get because they don't necessarily apply themselves in every situation. And let me give you like a really concrete example. You've been in corporate meetings, okay? I want you to picture yourself. You're in a corporate meeting. You're not the star of the meeting, right? There's somebody else who's doing the talking. There's somebody else who's the primary audience. You're merely there. When you're there and the person's talking, where are your eyes? Chances are you're watching the person talk. You know where my eyes are? I'm watching the person who's listening, like the person who's the primary audience. I'm watching them because I want to know what they react to. I want to know when their eyes open up. I want to know when they furrow their brow, when they smile, when they tune out, because I'm trying to figure out what they're interested in. That kind of cognitive engagement in meetings where you're not the star.
So you're doing inference.
I am, but it's. But the piece there that's important though is that I'm cognitively engaged in a meeting where I'm not the star, and to me that gives you repetitions, and those repetitions, like over the course of a month, do they matter? Probably not. But over the course of a year or 3 years or 5 years, like it's the difference between someone who's sort of a Hall of Famer and somebody who's merely very good at their job. I think it creates separation, and so for those early career folks, I think you start by being cognitively engaged in every opportunity. And then you got to know that that's going to add up over time.
So having someone sit in on a meeting and they're serving inference, reading between the lines, sentiment analysis, trying to figure out what was really being said as opposed to what was being said at a superficial level.
I think that's part of it. And then even just listening to the lingo, the language, the things that happen. My admin at Nokia, as an example, she's earlier in career. Like I would love to get her, she's crazy capable. And so I've told her, look, we're doing strategy planning now. I said, look, sit in the meetings. You might not have much to contribute, but sit, pay attention, and we'll soak up some of that information. And I think what that does is it gives her options later on because she becomes more familiar. I think anyone who's early in career, you got to get some exposure. And I think the exposure helps you over time. because you start to become conversational in an area where maybe you lack a little bit of confidence. And once you add some confidence to some basic skills, I think the combination is pretty potent.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for someone who's early career. What about someone that's more mid-career? Maybe you worked with them 10, 15 years ago, you bump into them at a conference and you sense that they seem a little bit burnt out, a little bit lost, and they're looking for some advice from you on how to kind of navigate this career pivot, this career transition to get back on track. They want to stay in something related to data centers, digital infrastructure, critical facilities. What would you tell a friend, a former coworker like that?
I think there's two things, right? There's big technology changes. I mean, bottom line, if you're not atop the technology changes, no one's going to trust you. So if you don't know what's going on in the AI space, if you don't know what's going on in DevOps and operations, I mean, you've got to be conversational in these technology areas. And so I would encourage people to become at least conversational there. I think if you ignore the trends, then at some point you are just out of position. But if you're on top of the trends, right, then understand that what you've got to do is get to the bottom of how people make these transitions. You see, there's a marketing world out there that's painting out a place that we want to be, right? It's more open, it's more automated, it's AI driven. It's I don't know, maybe there's more software defined control. Maybe you've got full stack integration. Pick any buzzword you want. And if you look at that marketing hype and you look at where people are today, I mean, the on the ground reality is very different than where people are today. And you've got to become proficient not just in what the destination is, but in where people are now. And then you've got to be able to understand what are the things that prohibit people from moving forward. What are the great inhibitors to progress? And if you can understand those, then I think you can talk quite contextually around where people are. So what are the great inhibitors to progress? Some of it's technology for sure, like there's elements of that, but even like how do you secure funding in an organization, right? Or, there's a big skills mismatch, or, the great automation wave, you're trying to sell that to a group of people who are effectively going to be out of work if these dreams of laying waste to the workforce so we can save a few dollars, like if that becomes true. So how do you sell something to somebody who's at risk if they go and purchase that? Like these are the things that we're going through, and so you got to start to think through. Again, I lean back a lot on psychology because that's my own personal bent. Like I believe that's how you create advantage in these areas. But like, how do you present something in a way that gives people the confidence to move forward? How do you make it clear what the migration is, not just the endpoint? I think those are the types of things that allow people to really break free. And then once you realize that there's a big gap between the haves and have-nots in our industry, the Microsofts and the Googles and the AWSs and roughly everybody else, once you realize that, then you tune your approach and you say, rather than starting at the end, like I want to know where the end is, because if you don't know where you're going, any steps the right direction. But let me start where you're at and then start to figure out how do I make the right first step and the right second step. When you get into that kind of model, then I think you provide way more tangible value to the people that you're selling to. And I think those people are gonna have more success. So the people who are like mid-career, look, be topically on top of things, right? Like make sure that you are, current. That doesn't mean you have to be an expert, but make sure you're current. And then make sure you understand what people are actually looking for. Are they looking to buy the thing, or are they looking to handle the migration or the transition? And I'll tell you, more people are looking at the transition than you think. And if you can do that, you'll be positioning the thing that they need, and everybody else will be positioning the thing that seems unattainable. And if you're the one person that's bringing sanity, credibility, and maybe a little dose of reality to the sales engagement, if you're the one person bringing that, I promise you'll have outsized returns.
So this is the whole idea that the future of an account executive involves a lot more consulting and solving a lot more problems than focusing just on running a playbook that their employer put in front of them.
100%. For sure, right? What I'm looking for is someone who's a partner in crime. I always joke. I say, let's go make some bad decisions together, right? It's kind of funny, right? But the operable word is together, right? Like I want to be on the same side of the problem as the person I'm talking with. It's not me versus you. I hope you buy my thing. It's me and you versus the problem. So you better have a really profound understanding of the problem. And right now, I'll tell you, like almost nobody has a problem that is like, my problem is I don't have enough of your gear. Like that's not really my problem, right? Like my problem is, this week we're talking about AI, and so I'm putting together a bunch of AI stuff, and you mentioned inferencing, right? So we're talking LLMs and DeepSeek, and then everyone kind of, what are we doing there? And then all of a sudden, inferencing is going to be the next big thing that kind of comes along, and there's implications to that. And then once we get through that and we get funding for that, you don't think there's going to be another thing that sits behind it? Like the actual problems customers face, it's like, how do I make sense of all that? Because AI is kind of new, but like, look, if we went back, 5-7 years, I'll take just the data center networking, not even the whole data center, just the networking side, right? We've had things like, cloud and DevOps and multi-cloud and intent-based networking and software-defined networking and Kubernetes and observability and now AI and then inferencing. That's like over 8 or 9 years. Every year there's like a whole new paradigm. Like I'm going to tell you, like the problem people have, yes, they got to be able to solve some problems, and they have to try to keep pace with something that, like, it's unreal how fast things are moving. And I can't, if I'm 45 years old, right, I can't go get a PhD. I don't have the time anymore. I've got kids. Like I can't spend my weekends and my nights, in the basement reading up on something, because like I have a family. So how do I keep up? If you're a salesperson, you realize that it's hard to keep up, then your approach is actually very different. It's like, look, how do we solve that problem for you? Yes, I'm going to try on this new port, this new thing that's going to give you some technology. But on top of that, let me help you solve the keeping up problem. You solve that for me, I will always have time for you. Like this is, again, I think people need to look more broadly than, what is my solution? What is my use case? I think you got to look at your customer, actually listen. And then if you do that, you're going to find that there's a whole set of things that you can do to help. And some of those, might not result in a PO, but I'm telling you, you get someone's, you engender loyalty and trust. At some point, business will happen.
That's the key part, is being able to add enough value and have enough credibility with knowledge to be able to get to that point of trust. I've heard that a couple times in some talks last year with sales execs on the data center operator side, were the people that were really knocking it out of the park and felt stable in their long-term progression in their career were getting technical enough that it felt like they could almost be a fractional CTO nights and weekends for small and medium-sized businesses. Like they got to that level of a handful of different networking certifications and terminology that they could have a discussion where it felt like one of their prospects was almost talking to like a mid-career, at least entry, advanced beginner kind of CTO. And it forces a lot of reskilling and professional development.
Well, so even, you mentioned the inferencing things. Let's take the AI stuff, right? How do you have a relevant conversation around AI? I think you have to put in a little bit of research on that. Like you do have to become, somewhat current on it. There's a site called Semi-Analysis with Dylan Patel, by the way. So go take a look at that stuff. It's really, really good. But like understanding that, in a typical AI rack, it's going to run, 120 kilowatts for like the high end stuff. Like that's an interesting data point, right? Because what it means is the problem in data center is not necessarily, how do I make the server work, or how do I connect storage, or what does the network look like? The base problem is like, how do I get enough power? Yeah. Which then changes the conversation. So when you go in and you're talking about like the power requirements and what are the different business models around different facilities and what's the right strategy, it's like all of a sudden now you're a different resource. You're not a walking data sheet. What you are is someone who can actually give some strategic advice. I've had a number of, like, I meet with maybe 150, 175, 200 customers a year, somewhere in that range. And when I talk to people, I rarely talk about, here's my product. I spend most of my time talking about like, here's, did you know that you have to think through multi-year purchase commitments when you're buying GPUs? That doesn't help me sell networking, but what it does is it helps inform somebody like, oh, I didn't realize that. What are the implications of that? So are you going to tie up your CapEx for 4 years if you don't know what your use case is going to be? How do you navigate that? Is the right answer to build or is it to effectively lease through a utility model? Like these are good conversations. And if you can have even the surface level part of those conversations, I'm telling you, you're different than your counterparts at your competition. You add more value, and that more value will give you more access. Now, whether you can convert access to sales, at some point you will be dependent on product, but But having more access will certainly give you an advantage over other people who don't have that access because they're more interested in talking about their stuff than trying to solve the broader problem.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
So given that the diagnosing, giving before prescribing, exploring before putting insights and recommendations out there, what do you see as the biggest challenge or the biggest problem that go-to-market professionals in the data center industry are facing right now?
I'm going to go with one that's a little bit off. So I do like a lot of enablement training. I'm in the field a ton, right? Like I put together courses. I will tell you, this is true at every company I've been at. We don't do discovery very well. Okay, so when we ask questions of the customer, we're usually, and I'm going to speak from a networking perspective just to make it more specific. So if I take my field people like in my current role, and when we go in, we do discovery, we're trying to qualify the opportunity. What we're trying to do is construct a network diagram. Like in our heads, we're trying to figure out what does the network look like because we want to sell networking things. And so we don't really use our questions in our discovery to surface what are the pain points, what are the constraints, how do I use my listening skills to advance my sales objectives. There's a bunch of stuff that we don't do because in a rush to figure out is it a square hole or a circular hole for my square or circular pegs, we're more interested in asking questions to pattern match our products than we are to actually understand what's going on. What I think people need to do is ask questions to get understanding of, who the person they're talking to is. Find out, what what are the pain points, but what are the perceived constraints? What are the obstacles? Well, again, I'll stay in the AI theme because I think it's topical and relevant right now. Within AI, right, every company has a board level of directive, go do AI things. Now, that's going to break down across different people in the organization in different ways. If you're at the top of the organization, you're what I would call a perpetrator. You're the one that's like initiating action. If you're a perpetrator, then what you want to hear about is like all the possibilities. Tell me why my idea is so good. And so I need to be like a real zealot. But as you feed that further in the organization, then people they shift from perpetrators to victims. They're the ones that have to carry out the decision of somebody else. When you're on the victim side, right, AI is happening to you, and so all you see is the obstacles and the constraints. You don't want to hear all the hype. You want to know, like, how do I practically get this done? Because this has been given to me without a whole lot of thought in some cases. And so even that, like, identifying, whether somebody's on the decision-making side or the decision-receiving side, like those are two very different sales pitches. So I think qualification, like if I could put, if I could make people, let's say, twice as good at any one thing, I tell you right now, I would rather have my sellers today who are selling my products at Nokia. If I could double up on anything, it would be their understanding of how to do discovery. And if you do that really well, then I'm telling you, like I've got some crazy stories where I've used discovery where I literally only talked about my stuff for 5 minutes in an hour and 15-minute conversation, but advanced the deal further through questions than we had advanced that opportunity in that customer in the last 7 years through talking and talking and talking.
So that gets at the heart of, is there a future of different kinds of comp plans that not only in SaaS, they've experimented for years with, if somebody sticks a certain amount of months before the full comp is paid out, or if they churn too quickly, the full comp isn't paid out. Is there something that rewards certain deal stages that are being advanced through based on better discovery? And is there enough muscle memory, pattern recognition on different kinds of use cases, different kinds of personas that you really can truly equip someone that's specializing in a certain vertical at a certain kind of company size where they know consistently that this playbook around discovery really knocks it out of the park?
I think comp plans are tough. You got to be careful what you incentivize, because people will find a way to game the system, right? We've all been victims of some comp plan where where someone starts selling shelfware because they've figured out that if they include it in the bundle, they can apply discounts a different way. So I don't know about comp plans. I think that's hard. On incentivizing people to stay around, like I have seen that. Obviously, in some cases you pay on book, in other cases you pay on delivery. I actually like a customer success motion, which is really different than a value-based motion. I think in the software world, I like the idea of going in and providing access to things, and then in the whole like freemium model, and then using the year that follows as a way of kind of securing and making sure things are actually in deployment. I like that model, and I think that model leads to a different type of engagement. I think different strokes for different folks. I mean, different portfolios are going to have different sensitivities. I also think that you have to look a little bit like, how do you handle franchise pricing, and how do you apply discounts, especially when you get into like large bills of materials that have lots of disparate products in them. But I mean, I guess the net of all of that is that, once you arrive on what you want to pay out as a company, what's the behavior you want to reward, then I do think that it can be different than just like, hey, here's the booking or here's the revenue. Let's comp on that. The types of behaviors I like customer success behaviors more broadly. So like, is this thing actually in deployment? So pay out on book, but then, put in kickers, whether it's multiple multipliers or accelerators or gates.
So what's really interesting about all of that is you've had so much broad experience across full business units, plus go-to-market teams, and like a general manager kind of role, heavy on product strategy. Really curious to get your thoughts on how this type of role, how do you envision what you do changing over the next 2 to 4 years? What do you think will stay the same with growing a business like this? What do you think will be different?
That's a good question. I mean, typically at startups, they always say the CEO has to be the number one salesperson. And then once you scale, then you shift and you focus on different things. What we've got to do is, in my current role, is scale the business, right? That it's a kind of a classic scaling motion right now. I think so right now I'm focused on how do I activate more people? How do I make them more proficient? It's mostly about getting the things that are in my head out into a system that can be followed. Hero sales are difficult to scale. So the things that I do, I can't really teach other people to do, because if your success requires people to have a PhD and 15 years, 20 years of experience in a domain, then you'll never scale, right? It's impossible to do it profitably, because you got to pay so much to pick up that kind of stuff. So I think, generally speaking, I think my job will, like, as we're successful at scaling, then I shift, and it really becomes, how do you drive a velocity motion? A velocity motion is very different. It's about what's the structure, what are the incentives, like we were just talking about. How do I effectively make it easier to transact quickly? There's a lot of things you do in the systems. In hero sales, I don't really need to worry that much about my back-end quoting tools, because my hero is going to go and do all of that. But when I go and scale that, then how do I get 1,000 people to be able to transact? If I'm selling indirectly, how do I handle pricing approvals? And there's just a lot more systemic stuff. I think what's going to happen with me is that, in my current role anyway, I think as we scale this business, I'll spend less time on the front lines and more time on the back end systems. It's a different job. This is actually why you see a lot of turnover in companies that have scaled, because the people that have to get you to the first mile marker are sometimes different than the people who have to get you to the fourth or fifth mile marker. And so it's pretty natural to see people change through that. What I've got to do is I've been on both sides of that. I've kind of managed a lot of it. What I've got to do now is sort of make that transition, where my focus is going to be a bit different. And then as a result, I've also got to make sure I bring in people who can operate in the new environment, kind of the 2B environment, which means, in some cases, actually dissuading some of the hero behaviors that serve us pretty well in building the business. Like, that's a big change and kind of a big emphasis on the leadership side.
It almost sounds like what you're describing has an intrapreneurial flavor to it, where at some point you'll feel you've hit a certain tipping point where it hits a more mature business, and it's a different
strategy,
good market.
Yeah. So the way I describe it, like I've spent like I got to push a rock up a hill right now, and if I'm lucky, the rock is not square, right? That's hard. Pushing a rock up a hill is, the Sisyphean task of doing that is hard. But when you want to rest, you can kind of just rest. The rock kind of balances against your back. At some point, though, you crest the hill, and then you spend the rest of your time chasing the rock down the other side. And in many ways, that's actually more exhausting because there's no rest. And so what I think is going to happen is we'll crest that hill, and then it's like, how do I, when everybody is driving as fast as they can, when the hiring is sort of distributed and it's fast and copious, how do you keep everybody aligned? How do you make sure that you don't stray too far from like your core value? How do you make sure that your core investments are there, that you're protecting your core use cases? Like that's actually a really hard thing to do. And it's a different problem than how do you get people off the ground. So for me, I mean, like if you're looking for the metaphor, like it's going to be, pushing a rock up a hill. I can see the peak now, by the way. So it's not, I think we're setting up for it. Once we hit that peak though, it's going to be go time, because I'll spend the rest of my time at Nokia running down the other side trying to keep up.
Do you think any of these challenges are any different with your internal team versus channel partners?
That's an interesting question. I think the channel partners, I mean, they have a more difficult problem, because what you're doing now is you've got a bunch of different suppliers that are all kind of at different stages, and they're all telling you that they're at the top of the hill about to crest. And you've got to make decisions about where do you actually invest your time. I think internally, it's like, how do I scale a single thing or a small number of things? Whereas at a channel, everyone's trying to scale for you, and then you have to make a decision, like which bet do I go and pursue? I think the loss of control actually makes the channel part a little bit harder now that I think about it. I don't know that I thought about it before you asked the question, but if I was at a channel partner now, it's like everybody tells you how good it's going to be. How do you know who's telling the truth? And then you got to put in some bets on that. Like, who am I gonna bet with? The temptation is to believe everybody, right? Everyone's telling me the truth, and so I want to do a little bit of everything. My eyes are bigger than my stomach, so to speak. But you actually do have to place bets on a relatively small number of strengths, and you got to pick winners. I think that's hard. Like, it means you have to be strategically sound. It means you have to be kind of contextually aware. You got to be able to read the tea leaves and see the future a little bit. And I do think you have to trade in optionality. If you don't know precisely what the outcome is going to be, you got to take a relatively small set of actions that gives you permission to participate in whatever the big outcomes are going to be. I think that's a different way of thinking. Most people are transactional and project-based. Like, here's the 10 things I'm going to go do. I think when you're in the channel, I think that I don't think you can necessarily do that, because there's so much that's outside of your control. So the best you can do is like, here's the things I'm going to do that create the most options for me going forward. And then when I see the next wave of information, I'm going to choose which of those options I press and put more effort behind.
What's super interesting too, as you mentioned, you still have to get the channel partners to believe, which when I talk to people from much smaller companies, they often have a rose-colored, very Disney-like perception of how easy it's going to be to scale a channel partner ecosystem. And yet you're sitting within a very well-respected blue chip technology brand, and you're still having to get the channel partners to believe.
It's crazy hard. I think what people focus on, so I'll say we, like, on behalf of the entire industry. I know it's not fair to speak on behalf of the entire industry, but I will. We focus a lot on, like, here's why my box is better than their box. Like, when you're talking to the channel, it's like, here's how I'm going to make you more profitable. Like, you're actually going to make more money, which is really around what are your blended margins, which is different, right? It's software and service attached. It's not merely moving my product. The top line doesn't really matter that much. And on straight product resale, the markups are not that awesome. And so the question is going to be like, how do I improve profitability, which is a different conversation. And so I think one of the things that I've learned somewhat painfully, because I've gotten this wrong before, is you can't be enamored by how good your thing is. You got to look and be like, how is it going to make this person money? And if it's a salesperson, like, how are they getting paid? And if it's a principal in their business, how is it pulling other parts of their portfolio? And if it's the owner, right? The partner, the named partner. It's like, things like rebate programs and MDF, like, how does it funnel dollars or euros or, whatever currency back into the business? Like, these are bigger than, did you know my box has this feature? So I think it changes a lot of like how you engage with the channel. And then you realize that it's not one conversation. You got to have like 3 or 4 different conversations. Like with the salespeople, it's like, how do we do account planning? With the practice leads, it's like, how do I drive profitability? With the architects, it's like, actually, my box is better than your box. And with the principals and owners, it's like, here's how we've structured the program. Here's how dollars flow. Here's governance and administration. Like, those are 4 different conversations. And when you talk to someone who's managing channel partners, like, ask yourself, like, how many channel partner managers do you know that can have all 4 of those conversations? It's just, there's not that many. And chances are they don't even know there's 4 conversations. Like, the average channel partner I've met is like, or the partner managers I've met, the average one knows that we got to have the our box is better than their box conversation, but the other 3 are kind of out of scope.
And I see even on the recurring and on the managed side, there's an enormous amount of pain on improving renewals. And that's a whole separate discipline, even beyond the segmentation and personalization and customization strategy you're talking about, with really understanding the different stakeholders and the different job to be done that you are performing for each of them.
Well, and renewals gets into like pricing strategies and like sort of where do you maintain franchise pricing? I'll give you like an easy example. Let's say I really want to sell this piece of software, but I can't quite get it in, but it's really important that I get it in. Should I discount it 95 points or should I discount it 100? I'd rather discount it 100 than 95. You take 95 points off, you just reset the base price to 5%. You take 100 points off, I'm conceding right now that you don't have the budget, but I'm going to spend the next year proving to you that this has value. And when I come back, I don't want to be anchored to a 95 point off discussion. I want to have opportunity to go capture it if I can indeed prove value. Like, that's a different type of conversation. And I think people got to be thoughtful about, how you go in and navigate some of that stuff.
And gets back to not only pricing strategy, but comp plans and how to motivate and incentivize both internal and channel teams.
100%. I like if and this is where a lot of the incentive structures actually fall short, right? Is this, there's no notion of franchise pricing. So if there's 2 things, right, thing A and thing B, but thing A is going to be purchased in volume, every year because it's going to be refreshing or expanding, and thing B is sort of like an over the top thing. Where I want to preserve franchise pricing is on thing A, because I don't want to give up. If I give up money in year 1, that money's gone in year 2, year 3, year 4. And so, sometimes we look at thing B, we're like, hey, this shiny software thing is the thing I want to go and monetize. Maybe, but if that comes at the expense of, year 2, year 3, year 4 revenue, did you make the right decision? Like, I think there's decisions there. There's strategic gaps there in how people think about it. And I think the companies that do it really well, by the way, like it's simple. Customers want easy things to buy. Like, just make it easy. I think in many ways, like don't be exotic. Just go in with the simplest structure possible, and then do that thing really, really well, and then everybody kind of wins. But sometimes we'll fool ourselves into more complex structures because we're trying to figure out how we incentivize some piece of the portfolio.
One more area I want to cover before we land the plane. I feel like we've done a fantastic job with giving some advice to AEs and SDRs, to account managers, to channel partner folks. What do you feel is where can marketers make the biggest impact going forward to help drive a data center related business forward in the coming months and in the coming years?
I think there's just too much noise in the market. And so anybody who can help people find clarity, like find realism. Again, not everything is AI, but I'm going to use it as an example. When everyone's talking about AI, like if everyone's zigging, maybe that's the time to zag. I think it's fine to say that here's the reality. I think the future actually isn't going to be the future of like products over the next 3 to 5 years. I don't think it's going to be determined by how fancy the future vision is. I think it's going to be boring innovation that carries the day. Like, at the end of the day, the people who actually need to make decisions, they have day jobs, they have things that they do on a Tuesday afternoon. And it's fine to say that you're going to have this esoteric, somewhat exotic impact in year 5, year 6, year 7, but you got to make a difference on Tuesday afternoon. So what's your Tuesday afternoon value prop? Are you saving them time? Are you going to make it easier to do this thing? Are you going to, have a self-documenting thing? Like it's going to be things that we think are mundane, but connect to people. And the reason I say that is that in a world that's defined by the hype, if you're the person that can connect it to the reality, what you're going to have is credibility, which is going to give you unusual influence over the first 2 or 3 steps that they take. And that is going to give you account control. If you're in marketing, peddle in truth and clarity, highlighting that things are not known, highlighting even the deficiencies. No marketer wants to say, here's the deficiency in my product. But if you went out and said, look, here's what we did, here's what works, and here's what doesn't work, you know what you're going to get? You were going to get trust. And if everyone is out there barking and chirping and you're the one that they trust, who do you think is going to get more at bats? You're going to get more at bats. I think marketers need to be right now, I would say generally, by the way, but I'll say especially right now, they need to be, you need to be transacting in truth and evidence. Like assertions don't carry the day when it's a loud marketplace and everybody is shouting. At that point, if it's a loud marketplace, the largest companies who have the biggest budgets, they dominate the airwaves. So if that's not you, then you got to find a different way. So maybe shout something different.
So the question from a cultural perspective is, how do you create this environment where there's enough psychological safety where people feel comfortable with damaging admission as a really clear playbook to getting to be like what Seth Godin called 20 years ago, the purple cow, where you're driving along and you see hundreds or thousands of ordinary looking cows and all of a sudden the purple one pops up out of nowhere?
I think the easiest way is to be thoughtful about the forums and the venues. I think small events are better than large events, as an example. So everyone knows you can pick like a very large event, pick GTC or reInvent or whatever. You go there, like, does the audience, like, any of the messages really break through there? Maybe. Maybe the loudest one does. Like maybe somebody is like really on top of something, but the average player there, actually, their message doesn't really get heard. Everyone claims you have to be there, by the way, because if you're not there, then you're not seen as credible. Fine, right? Maybe that's true. I don't personally subscribe to that ROI model, but I understand why people do. But you go to smaller events, you go to local. Like I'd rather have 15 people in a room who are listening to me than 50,000 in a room who are listening to everybody, because I'm going to generate more qualified leads out of that. Old school guerrilla marketing, lunch and learn kind of thing. I don't want to compete with dinner and family time. I want to compete with, lunch. And you put me in that environment, I think we do better. When you're in those smaller environments, then the risk of saying something more authentic is lower. And so if you go out and you were to say something, you can try it with a small audience. If people don't like it, okay, maybe you blew it with 15 people, but you didn't blow it with 50,000. So I think you can start to develop a little bit of a track record. And then even then, if I say you should trade in evidence, then trying something small and using the evidence to steer you going forward, I think it's a useful thing. And everything we've said here, in terms of how we communicate with customers, I would argue is psychologically the same as you would communicate within your company, right? How do you provide evidence? How do you speak truth? How do you, this is what I would go do. I think the truth will set you free. I know perhaps it's a bit of a naive thing to think, but I just believe right now with so much uncertainty, everyone's looking like, who should I believe? And if you're the one that people should believe, then I think you wield unusual influence, both internally and externally. I think it leads to superior outcomes. And for the people who have the evidence on their side, then they'll move forward with confidence because they'll say, I'm right. And when you have that confidence, then you can imbue other people with the same confidence. And I think that's what's going to get people to move.
I love the idea of educating in smaller groups as well, especially as they talk about owned media versus earned media. There's owned events too, the lunch and learns, the breakfast seminars, hosting your own. And then when you look at the cost of these really large national and global conferences, you literally can do like 50 or 100 webinars, 50 or 100 lunch and learn events, breakfast seminars for pretty much the same. And then all of a sudden now 100% of the audience that's in the room is your ideal client profile, is your ideal channel partner profile. It's the right people, and they're paying 100% of their attention to you and learning with you.
So imagine a roadshow across the U.S. as an example. So take maybe you sink $400,000 into a large show, or you do 100 $4,000 events. Like for a lunch and learn, that's a crazy expensive lunch and learn too, by the way.
Yeah.
Let's say you're picking up like a hotel and maybe you're flying private to get there. Like, I don't know, but let's say you fill the room with 12 people per. Like, what do you think is more of the 12 people times 100 events? That's 1,200 people, or the 350 badge scans of the looky-loos and trick-or-treaters at your booth? Which one of those yields more opportunities, more pipeline? Like, I'm a show me the money kind of guy. Like, give me pipeline all day long.
I talked to someone a couple of months ago who made a commercial real estate decision with moving their office because their lunch and learn program was so powerful that getting 30, 40 people in a room once a month for a net cost, I think $1,000, $2,000 or something like that, was massively moving the needle on pipeline creation. And all of a sudden, people were bringing the rest of their team with them. And now they're talking about how do they record it for all the people that weren't and repurpose it and everything. But yeah, this is confidence, and it's reps, and it's more reps and more confidence.
Tell me how many people are having that conversation about, insert show of choice. Like nobody's like, hey, how do I get more? I go to VMworld, I'm picking one that's not there anymore. I go to VMworld, how do I get 6 VMworlds a year? Like no one was thinking that. Everyone's like, we can do one of these. It's like a lot of effort goes into it. It craters the budget every year. No one was like, how do we get 6 of these a year? But you give someone a successful lunch and learn, like everybody wants to do that, because a chance for a salesperson just to sit down. And like I've seen really cool ideas on that too, right? Somebody did one, I don't remember who it was, but one of our partners did one where they did like custom tailoring, like just fitting. All they did is they brought you in, they got you like fitted. They didn't even get you the clothes with it, by the way. It was like just get measured for like a bespoke shirt or something, and then they had some discount. That's an awesome idea. Or like come in and get like professional headshot and then, have some lunch and do whatever. Like these are great ideas. These are things that people need to do anyway. It's like, they don't have to be like crazy expensive. And then, have lunch, right? I mean, it's and a 45-minute discussion and people kind of hang around afterwards. I think you can build a lot of pipeline using old school guerrilla tactics, because flat out, they just work.
And it's such small segments that you can get super precise on who the invites go out to and the composition of the room. So you're titling it, for example, with your product line, if there's something that NOC managers want to know about, if there's something that IT leaders in mid-size VARs or MSPs want to know about, you literally can title it for them. So there's a ridiculous amount of relevancy for them to take time out to do that they wouldn't get at a large show.
Well, you can even give them access to like really like industry experts as well. Like I've got a lot of soak time. I've done a lot of different things. When I go out and spend time in, in St. Louis or Kansas City, like I'm not saying like I'm the biggest draw, by the way, but I give them something that they wouldn't ordinarily get. And so you can actually, and if I go in and don't just hawk product, if I actually go in and just kind of move people along in that consultant kind of way, they get value. And then for us, it gives us opportunity, because they're like, look, these guys, gave me something that was valuable to me. I am interested in what you're doing. Like, I think people want to do business with people that do stuff for them. And so if you sincerely help somebody, they will sincerely come back to you. I just think it's a different way of engagement. I prefer smaller, more intimate settings at a much higher scale. And then I do like working with the partners to try to pull people in, because I think you work with partners to fill the room. And I think what it does is it brings in kind of the ecosystem of folks, which I think benefits the customers in the end.
Absolutely. Just providing an incredible amount of value. And instead of counting vanity metrics, you're literally counting how many relationships you build and what the lifetime potential is of that relationship.
I think that's a great summary.
Mike, I really appreciate you sharing so generously. If someone wants to learn more about what you're working on or connect with you, is LinkedIn a good place to reach you?
LinkedIn's the best place to reach me. I shut down the socials for reasons that might be obvious to people who are fleeing the socials. So Mike Bushong on LinkedIn. And then, if you mention the podcast piece, that gives me some context, and I'm happy to accept those types of requests. I was fortunate to have people mentor me quite aggressively early in my career, and I benefited greatly. And so I do try to pay that forward. And so if people have questions, if they're trying to navigate key decisions and whatnot, by all means, hit me up and ask me questions. I think sales is important. I think it's more than just purveying product, as I mentioned before. I do think that the whole industry moves forward as people do this well. And so I have a vested interest in helping folks. So please do reach out to me.
That's terrific. And I think you've more than earned the right to give yourself a little bit of a plug here. So if someone wants to learn more about Nokia's data center products, where would you send them? Is there a certain social channel, a certain part of the website?
If you look up Nokia data center, I think there's stuff that's there. The thing to look at, Container Lab, if I could send you one place, go to containerlab.dev. Container Lab actually has multi-vendor stuff. It's a project that we're doing, but we do it sort of for everybody. But on Container Lab, what you can do is you can experience products and software, and you can play with them in that environment. It's absolutely worth going to if you're interested in this kind of data center networking stuff. But and again, it is multi-vendor, so it'll give you a flavor and a bit of what everyone's kind of doing there. And then if you're looking for our product, there's a product called EDA. That's EDA. Take a look at that. Spin it up on Container Labs. Give it a spin or a try.
Cool. I'll make sure to include links to that in the show notes and the blog post for this podcast as well with the resources. But this has all been terrific. Mike, I really appreciate you sharing so generously today. I've been speaking with Mike Bushong, who is the VP of Data Centers at Nokia in San Diego. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Likewise.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.